British actor Michael Caine, or more correctly, Sir Michael Caine, recently celebrated his 90th birthday. The winner of 2 Academy Awards, a BAFTA and 3 Golden Globes, his films include the iconic 60s movies Alfie, The Ipcris File and The Italian Job. And later on he starred in Educating Rita and Batman. He also has a whole host of war movies under his belt too, including The Battle of Britain, The Eagle Has Landed, The Man Who Would Be King and A Bridge Too Far. And how can we forget the film that skyrocketed his career in 1964, Zulu, in which he plays Lieutenant Bromhead, one of the officers at the Battle of Rorke's Drift. But did you know that apart from acting in these war movies, Michael Caine actually has combat experience in his own right? Not in the Second World War, but in a conflict when the Cold War became a hot war. Long before Hollywood stardom, he charged in the dead of night, guns blazing, towards a unit of Chinese soldiers who were intent on hunting him down. This is the story of Michael Caine and his military service in the Korean War. Michael Caine, or to use his birth name, Maurice Joseph Micklewhite, was born in South London in 1933, the son of Ellen, a cook and charwoman, and a fish market porter, also called Maurice. During the Second World War, his father, Maurice Sr., served in the military, whilst Maurice Jr. was evacuated to near King's Lynn in Norfolk. Naturally too young to participate in the war, he was nevertheless one of the 2 million men conscripted for national service in Britain between 1947 and 1963. In 1952, Private 22486574 Maurice Joseph Micklewhite was enlisted in the 1st Battalion of the Royal Fusiliers. The Royal Fusiliers were one of the 4 English Fusilier regiments in the British Army at that time, the others being the Northumberland, the Lancashire and the Royal Warwickshire Fusiliers. Raised at the Tower of London by King James II in the 1680s, the Royal Fusiliers were also known as the City of London Regiment, which was an appropriate unit for a boy from the Elephant and Castle who would become an iconic Cockney film star. The Royal Fusiliers had an illustrious history and had spent the Second World War fighting in the Middle East, North Africa and Italy. They, along with the Northumberland Fusiliers, would also serve in the Korean War, as you're about to find out. After his initial training, Maurice Micklewhite, who from now on I will tend to refer to as Michael Caine, joined the regiment in Germany, where it was part of the British Army of the Rhine. Whilst in later life Caine advocated the benefits of military service, he freely admits that his early experiences of national service were tedious. He tended to be a bit of a barrack room lawyer and was often carrying out punishment chores, such as scraping a floor clean with a razor. Maybe it's not surprising that under these circumstances that when Caine was offered a way to finish his 2-year conscription early, he jumped at the chance. There was, however, a catch. He could finish his service a year early if he went to Korea to fight the communist North Koreans and their Chinese allies, a conflict now known as the Korean War. I go into more detail about the background of the Korean War in my story about the glorious Gloucesters and the Battle of the Imjin River, and I'll post a link to that video at the end and also in the description below. But in a nutshell, here is the timeline that takes us to the arrival of Private Maurice Micklewhite, the future Michael Caine, and the Royal Fusiliers in the conflict. Korea had been ruled by Japan, but upon the latter's defeat in 1945, the Korean peninsula had been divided into 2 zones by the United States and the Soviet Union, each installing a regime allied to them in their respective zones. The 2 superpowers withdrew from the peninsula, leaving their client regimes fating each other in an increasingly uneasy peace. And finally, on the 25th of June 1950, the communists in North Korea launched an all-out attack on their southern neighbour, swiftly occupying the capital, Seoul, and driving the South Korean forces all the way back to Busan on the very tip of the peninsula. South Korea appealed to the United Nations for military assistance, and 23 countries came to their aid. Whilst the United States supplied by far the largest contingents of troops, there was a significant Commonwealth contingent from Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, India and the UK. The UN Army supported the South Koreans in stabilising the line around Busan, and in September 1950 had launched a seaborne counter-offensive at Incheon. The counter-offensive soon became a rout as the North Koreans were pushed back across the border and then all the way back through the north until the UN's forces were in sight of the Chinese border on the Yellow River. It was at this stage that the Communist Chinese, for a variety of reasons, came to the North Korean support. Now facing the overwhelming numerical might of the Chinese People's Liberation Army, it was the turn of the UN and the South Koreans to go on the defensive. They were pushed back down the peninsula, once again losing control of Seoul. 1951 saw the seesaw nature of the conflict continue, with the UN forces once more seizing back Seoul before halting a major Chinese offensive on the Imjin River. The 1st Battalion of the Royal Fusiliers, under Lieutenant Colonel Dick Stevens, set sail from Liverpool on the troopship Empire Hallidale. Launched in the 1920s, the Empire Hallidale had an interesting history. Originally a German ship, when the Second World War broke out, she was in faraway Brazil. In a daring journey, she managed to slip through the Royal Naval blockade to reach Hamburg, where she was then commandeered by the German Navy and spent the war in the Baltic. Captured by the British in 1945, she was refitted as a troopship at John Brown & Co. at Clydebank in Scotland. And it was on this ship that Michael Caine departed for Korea to defend capitalism from communism, at a rate of pay of 4 shillings a day. As Caine later remarked, 4 shillings a day wasn't much of a price to defend the capitalist system. At the end of the 6-week journey, he joined C Company of the 1st Battalion for combat training in Japan, before being posted to the Korean conflict. By the time Caine and the rest of the Royal Fusiliers landed on the peninsula, the war had ground to a stalemate, with both sides poking each other to try and find an advantage, and to prevent the other side launching another major attack. The Royal Fusiliers went to the front line in the valley of the Samichon River. This river flows into the Imjin. They were part of the 28th Commonwealth Infantry Brigade, consisting of 2 British and 2 Australian infantry battalions. They were supported by 161 Battery of the 61st Field Regiment, Royal New Zealand Artillery, under Major Ernie Manders. The Royal Fusiliers, like many other soldiers in the Korean War, entered an almost troglodyte existence, sheltering in trenches and dugouts which were infested by rats and mosquitoes. The smell of human excrement used to fertilise the paddy fields added to the hellish atmosphere. And then Michael Caine had to come face to face with the Chinese enemy. But before I go on, if you're enjoying my work, then please consider becoming a patron so I can research and produce more stories for you. There'll be a link at the end. There's also one in the description below. Anyway, back to that first night in the trenches when Caine was to witness a Chinese attack in its awesome fury. Staring out into the pitch black, Caine's daydream was suddenly shattered by the eerie sound of a trumpet call somewhere in front of him. "What the beep was that?" he whispered to another soldier nearby. More trumpet calls echoed across the valley, and the British turned on their searchlights. Less than a mile away, advancing out of their trenches, were thousands of Chinese troops being led by hundreds of trumpeters. The New Zealand artillery battery opened up, but their shells seemed to have no effect. The Chinese just kept coming. Even the minefield, carefully laid by the Royal Fusiliers, had no impact on this human wave. Chinese soldiers literally running onto the mines so the men following could pass through. More of their comrades throwing themselves on barbed wire and acting as a bridge for their comrades behind. For the 19-year-old Caine and the other young Royal Fusiliers, it was both awe-inspiring and terrifying at the same time. Caine, operating an American .30 caliber machine gun, opened fire. The Chinese attack was like something out of the First World War. Their commanders just kept sending wave after wave of men forward in the hope that eventually their numbers would prevail. But they didn't prevail that night, nor on subsequent attacks that they launched against the British positions in this sector. And afterwards, Caine recalled seeing the Chinese dead clustered in groups of 4, sharing one weapon. Prior to going to Korea, Caine, coming from his tough, working-class upbringing in London, had some sympathy for the communists. As he saw the complete disregard the communist commanders had for the lives of their men, he changed his opinion. The communists talked about the people, but they didn't care about them. Surviving that sort of fanatical attack can shape a man for the rest of his life. But Caine was to have an even more frightening encounter with the Chinese. One night, he was part of a 3-man patrol sent out to observe the Chinese lines. Covered in mud and mosquito repellent, Caine, together with a wireless operator and a young officer, crept through a rice paddy field towards the Chinese positions. The young officer, Robert Mills, offered Caine and the wireless operator £5 each if they would sneak into the Chinese lines and grab a prisoner for interrogation. Caine told him in no uncertain terms what he could do with his £5 and his madcap idea. So slowly they made their way back through the tall grass of the rice field towards the safety of their own lines. Suddenly, the aroma of garlic filled Caine's nostrils. As he recalled later, the Chinese soldiers had a habit of chewing garlic the way American GIs chewed gum. They were being followed in the darkness. The three men hit the ground. He lay there absolutely still, hardly daring to breathe, his finger on the trigger of his gun. They heard the swish of the grass and hushed whispers of the Chinese. Caine was suddenly overcome with a powerful emotion. He was just 19, with his whole life ahead of him, and here he was, about to be killed or taken prisoner in a paddy field in Korea. He felt a fury about his situation and determined that if he was going to die, he would take as many Chinese soldiers down with him as he could. Very quietly, he conferred with Mills and the wireless operator. They agreed to go down fighting. They also agreed to, silently as possible, have one last pee before they died. Pee completed, they sprang up from their cover and charged at the Chinese, firing madly. The Chinese were taken completely by surprise and fired blindly into the darkness. With the muzzle flashes from this firefight lighting up the night, the British and their New Zealand artillery opened fire on the Chinese. How many men they hit is not known. Maybe they didn't hit any at all. But through the darkness, those three men of the patrol ran, first one way, then another, trying to throw off their pursuers. And eventually, they'd reached the safety of C Company, 1st Battalion Royal Fusiliers lines. In his autobiography, The Elephant to Hollywood, published in 2010, Caine said that every now and then, the whiff of garlic takes him back to that paddy field in Korea, even all these years later. His actions in Korea didn't earn Caine any medals for valour. Recently he recalled, "There are no heroes in war. It's just a question of doing a job and surviving." It seems to echo words from veterans down through the years. After that close encounter with death, Caine was never afraid of anything in his later acting career. And that acting career would start not long after he was demobbed. Just as an aside, that young platoon officer, Robert Mills, would also end up in an acting career where, amongst other roles, he appeared as Captain Swan in 2 episodes of Dad's Army. Caine completed his tour of duty in Korea and returned to Britain, once more aboard the Empire Hallidale. He concluded his national service at the Royal Fusiliers HQ, the Tower of London. Dressed in his army-issue demob clothes, he marched out of the Tower of London to the Fusilier Quick March, the British Grenadiers. And so Private Maurice Micklewhite marched out of the army, and Michael Caine marched into a 6-decade-long film career. Interestingly, his first acting role in a film was in the 1956 war movie A Hill in Korea, released in the USA as Hell in Korea, in which he played a private on a patrol in the Korean War. The film also starred Stanley Baker, who Caine would again team up with in Zulu. As the only member of the cast who'd actually served in Korea, he ended up giving lots of technical advice, not always invited. An American technician marvelled at his knowledge, and more importantly asked the question, "The British were in Korea?" The answer was, yes, they had been. 60,000 British servicemen served in the Korean War. 1,100 were killed, 2,600 wounded. Now, that's twice the number killed in action in the recent conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq, and 5 times those killed in the Falklands conflict. Admittedly, the Americans lost a lot more, 37,000 killed in action. Even those figures pale when compared to the Chinese, the North Koreans and the South Koreans, who lost about 500,000 each, killed or wounded. And let's not forget the estimated 2 million Koreans from both sides of the border who perished during this war. An armistice was agreed in July 1953, around the time Michael Caine was arriving home in London. Despite all those millions of deaths, including those British servicemen, the borders basically went back to where they'd started. The Korean War has never officially ended. The potential for another war, involving more than just the 2 Koreas and costing many more lives, remains a very real possibility. On the back of the Second World War, the Korean War seemed to many in Britain a faraway sideshow. Another Fusilier veteran from the Korean War, Mike Mogridge, remembered returning home and going to a pub. A man commented that he hadn't seen him for a while and asked where he'd been. The former Fusilier told him he'd been in Korea. The other man seemed totally bemused and asked if he'd had a nice time. The answer for many returning soldiers was probably no, and it was no sideshow either. It was a moment where the Cold War became hot, and British troops ended up, with others, fighting the Chinese. A forgotten war that saw over 1,000 young British troops killed. It shaped many of those national servicemen's lives. Don't forget, Michael Caine was just 19 years old when he went into action against those Chinese. Caine sees similarities between that war and more recent British deployments in Afghanistan and Iraq. In his autobiography he wrote, "I know what it feels like to be sent off to fight an unpopular war that no one at home really understands or cares about, and then to come back and meet a complete lack of understanding, or worse, indifference." So next time you watch Michael Caine in Zulu or A Bridge Too Far or The Eagle Has Landed, remember that whilst he's an actor, he's also calling upon the real, terrifying wartime experiences of Private Maurice Joseph Micklewhite of the Royal Fusiliers during the Korean War. Well, thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed finding out about Michael Caine's military service in the Korean War. Why not watch another video on my YouTube channel now? And if you enjoy my work, then please consider becoming a patron. There's a link coming in a moment and in the description below. Oh, and don't forget to give me a like and a sub. Until the next time, thanks for your support, keep well, and I'll see you very soon.